Charlotte, North Carolina, September 21st, 2022. Dr. Elliot Graves, a 52-year-old respected psychiatrist, was found dead in his office late at night, long after his last scheduled appointment. What initially seemed like a natural death soon raised suspicions, prompting a deeper investigation. As detectives peeled back the layers of his personal and professional life, they uncovered a web of deception, dangerous obsessions, and a betrayal that sent shockwaves through the city's elite circles. Elliot had spent his entire career untangling other people's problems. His patients ranged from corporate executives struggling with burnout to recovering addicts fighting to stay clean. He believed in second chances, in redemption, and he had a reputation for taking on clients that other psychiatrists might avoid. He wasn't reckless, but he wasn't afraid to work with people who had questionable pasts, either. He thought he could handle them. His personal life, however, wasn't as well managed as his career. His marriage to Julia Graves, a high-profile defense attorney, had once been built on ambition and mutual admiration. They understood each other's drive, respected each other's work, and for years, their marriage had functioned like a well-oiled machine. But something had changed. They barely saw each other anymore, and when they did, the conversations were brief and distant. Julia spent most of her time in court defending high-profile clients. Elliot spent his days listening to the confessions of men and women who had done terrible things. Their professional lives had once fascinated each other. Now, they barely discussed them. Julia was as sharp and ruthless in the courtroom as Elliot was composed and methodical in his office. She had built a reputation for winning impossible cases. Violent offenders, career criminals, people who seemed beyond saving. She got them acquitted, and while it earned her a fortune, it also earned her enemies. There were people who despised her, who saw her as the reason dangerous men walked free. But Julia didn't care. She saw the law as a game, and she played to win. Elliot had never judged her for that. But in recent months, he had started to wonder how different their work really was. He tried to rehabilitate people. She got them off the hook. Somewhere along the way, their values had stopped aligning. Still, work was work. Elliot didn't let his marriage distract him. He had patients to see, cases to manage, and lives to try to fix. But there was one patient who stood out, Daniel Kessler. Daniel was 35 years old, a former addict with a long history of arrests. Assault, possession, DUI. His record was filled with bad decisions. But he was sober now, working as a personal trainer, trying to rebuild his life. On paper, he was making progress. But there was something about him that set off alarms. Elliot had dealt with plenty of addicts before. Some of them lied, some manipulated, some genuinely wanted help. Daniel was different. He was charming in a way that felt rehearsed. He spoke about his past with a kind of detachment that didn't fit the usual pattern of regret or shame. There was something performative about him, like he was playing the role of a man who had turned his life around rather than actually living it. At first, Elliot didn't think much of it. Patients often developed attachments to their therapists, and many tried to impress them, to present themselves in a better light. It was common. But Daniel's interest in Elliot went beyond the normal boundaries. He started asking personal questions about Elliot's life, his marriage, his house. At first, they were vague enough to seem harmless. But over time, they became more specific. He mentioned Julia, not by name, but as your wife. He talked about the stress of balancing work and marriage, about how men in high-stakes jobs sometimes lost sight of what really mattered. Elliot had never mentioned Julia in their sessions. Daniel had no reason to know anything about her. And yet, he did. At first, Elliot brushed it off. He assumed Daniel had done his own research, maybe looked him up online. But then, little things started happening. Daniel would show up outside the office when he didn't have an appointment. A few times, Elliot spotted him near his home, parked on the opposite side of the street. There was never a direct threat. No confrontations, no explicit warning signs. But the feeling of being watched, of being studied, was enough to unsettle him. Elliot had dealt with manipulative patients before, but this was different. This wasn't just a troubled man looking for guidance. This was someone playing a longer game. Julia started noticing a shift in Elliot's behavior. He was more distracted, less present. He didn't bring his work home, but something was weighing on him. She didn't ask. If he wanted to talk, he would. But he didn't. Elliot tried to convince himself that he was overthinking it. He had worked with dangerous people before. He had heard confessions of violence, of regret, of intentions that never saw the light of day. He had never been afraid of a patient before, and he wasn't about to start now. Dr. Elliot Graves had spent years believing that his marriage was built on a foundation stronger than passion or romance. It was built on respect, ambition, and a mutual understanding that their careers came first. He and Julia had always been busy people. Late nights at the office, long hours, phone calls that stretched into the early morning. It was normal, but lately, the distance between them had started to feel different. Julia had always been driven, but now she was barely home. On the rare nights she did come back before midnight, she was distracted, answering emails at the dinner table, brushing off conversation with vague mentions of a complicated case. Elliot didn't push. He knew better than anyone that some things in their lines of work couldn't be shared. He assumed it was stress. High-profile defense attorneys didn't get to clock out at 5 o'clock. He told himself it was nothing. The truth was, it wasn't nothing. Julia had always been in control. Her entire career was built on managing chaos, outmaneuvering prosecutors, and keeping her clients, and herself, one step ahead of disaster. She never made reckless decisions. But the moment she crossed the line with Daniel Kessler, something in her shifted. It started as curiosity. Daniel had been in Elliot's office for months, but Julia had never paid him much attention. To her, he was just another patient, another name on her husband's long list of troubled clients. But when she finally did notice him, she saw something Elliot didn't. He wasn't just some recovering addict. He wasn't some lost soul looking for help. There was something sharper beneath the surface, something calculated. He carried himself with confidence, the kind of self-assuredness that came from knowing exactly what kind of effect he had on people. Julia didn't mean for anything to happen, not at first. But when she ran into him outside Elliot's office one evening, something shifted. She had been leaving late, exhausted from a grueling day in court, and he had been standing there as if he had been waiting. He wasn't nervous or awkward the way most men would be in front of a woman like her. He was steady, watching her with the kind of focus she was used to seeing in boardrooms and courtrooms, the focus of someone who was sizing up the competition. That night, for the first time in years, Julia felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt wanted. At first, she told herself it was nothing, just a moment, a harmless flicker of attraction. But then the moments started piling up. Another meeting, another exchange that lasted longer than it should have. And before she even realized what was happening, she had stopped resisting. Julia had spent her entire life playing a game of control, and she convinced herself that this was just another version of it. She wasn't some reckless woman cheating on her husband. She was managing something, keeping it contained. She was wrong. Daniel had been obsessed with Elliot's life for months, but now, it wasn't just about the doctor. It was about her. Julia fascinated him. The way she moved, the way she carried herself, the way she could destroy a man's life in court with nothing but words. She wasn't like the other women he had known. Women who had been desperate, who had clung to him, who had been easy to manipulate. Julia wasn't easy. She was cold, calculated, and completely in control of everything she did. At least, that's what she thought. Daniel knew better. He knew what was happening, even if she didn't. She thought she was making decisions, setting the rules. But every time they met, every time she let him closer, he felt it shifting. She wasn't in control. He was. Meanwhile, Elliot had no idea. His days were filled with patience, paperwork, and the same routine he had followed for years. He had noticed that Julia was distant, but he chalked it up to stress. He told himself they had been married too long to expect anything different. Love changed over time. Passion burned out. He had no idea that while he was sitting across from Daniel in therapy, trying to help him rebuild his life, Daniel was already dismantling his. Daniel played the role of the recovering addict well. In their sessions, he spoke about his past with just the right amount of remorse, just enough self-awareness to make Elliot believe that he was truly trying. But in between the confessions and the progress reports, he was testing boundaries, pushing further into Elliot's personal life. He asked about marriage. He asked about love. He talked about how some people didn't really know the ones they were closest to, how sometimes the people we trusted most were the ones keeping the biggest secrets. Elliot never saw it for what it was. He thought Daniel was reflecting on his own past relationships, on the people he had hurt. It never crossed his mind that Daniel was talking about him. As the weeks passed, Julia's meetings with Daniel became more frequent. What had started as impulsive turned into something else, something neither of them wanted to name. For Julia, it was an escape, a way to feel something again. For Daniel, it was more than that. It was proof. Proof that Elliot wasn't as untouchable as he seemed. Proof that even the people closest to him could be taken away. Julia thought she could end it whenever she wanted. She thought she could walk away, go back to her life, and pretend nothing had happened. She had no idea that Daniel had never intended to let her go. Julia had always been calculated in everything she did. Every move, every case, every decision in her personal life had a purpose. But for the first time, she felt herself losing control. The affair with Daniel had started as a distraction, a brief escape from a marriage that had grown stale. She had convinced herself that she was the one in charge, that she could walk away whenever she wanted. But Daniel wasn't like other men. In the beginning, he had followed her lead. He played the role of the perfect affair, discreet, eager, never pushing too hard. They had met in places where no one would recognize them, hotel rooms in the city, hidden corners of upscale bars where no one paid attention. But as the weeks passed, Daniel wanted more. He wanted to be seen with her. Julia knew the risks, yet she let them slip. A drink in a public place instead of a hotel. A meeting outside her office where someone could recognize them. Daniel pushed, and instead of pulling away, she let him. She told herself it was harmless, that no one was paying attention. But someone was. Dr. Mark Ellis had known Elliot for years. They weren't close friends, but they worked in the same professional circles. He had always admired Elliot's steady nature, his ability to take on difficult cases without letting them get to him. And he had always respected Julia. She was intimidating, sharp, the kind of attorney who could dismantle a case with one sentence. Mark had never imagined she was the type to be unfaithful. That's why it caught him off guard when he saw her with Daniel. It was a small restaurant near downtown, a place where high-profile professionals often met for business dinners. Julia and Daniel were seated in a back booth, their heads close together. There was nothing outright inappropriate, no touching, no obvious affection, but it was the way they looked at each other. Julia, always so composed, looked alive in a way Mark had never seen before. And Daniel, he looked like a man who had already won. Mark didn't say anything. He wasn't one to gossip, and he wasn't about to get involved in something that wasn't his business. But the image stuck with him, and for the first time, he found himself wondering if Elliot knew. While Julia was crossing lines she thought she could erase, Daniel was becoming reckless in his own way. He had always been good at staying under the radar, at making people see what he wanted them to see. But lately, he wasn't being careful. Detective Sarah Nolan had been investigating a string of burglaries in the wealthier neighborhoods of Charlotte. At first, they seemed random: jewelry, electronics, cash stolen from homes with no signs of forced entry. But as she dug deeper, a pattern began to emerge. The victims weren't random. They were connected, and two of them had a direct link to Elliot Graves. The first was a former patient, a corporate executive who had been seeing Elliot for stress management. The second was a doctor who worked in the same professional circles. Both had their homes broken into. Both had reported missing valuables, but nothing major. Nothing that would suggest a professional thief. Nolan had seen this kind of thing before. Some burglaries weren't about the items stolen. Sometimes, they were personal. Someone sending a message. Daniel wasn't on her radar yet, but he was getting sloppy. He had never been good at control, not really. His entire life had been a cycle of addiction, violence, and failed attempts to start over. But this time, things were different. This time, he had Julia, and he wasn't going to lose her. At first, Julia ignored the warning signs. Daniel had always been intense, but that was part of what drew her to him. He looked at her like she was the most important thing in the world, like he would do anything for her. She liked the feeling. She liked the power of it. But then he started pushing too far. He began showing up unannounced. At her office, at the places he knew she went after work. Once, She spotted his car outside her house late at night. She told herself it was a coincidence, that he was just passing through. But the more it happened, the harder it was to ignore. Then there were the questions. Where were you last night? Who were you with? Why didn't you answer my call? At first, she laughed it off. She reminded him that she was married, that they had to be careful. But Daniel didn't seem to care about that anymore. One night, after another unexpected visit to her office, she finally confronted him. This has to stop, she told him. We have to be more careful. Daniel had smiled, but there was something in his eyes that made her uneasy. I don't want to be careful, he said. For the first time since the affair had started, Julia felt something she hadn't before. Fear. Meanwhile, Elliot remained oblivious. He had noticed that Julia was colder lately, more distant, but he had assumed it was work stress. He had seen it before. When she was preparing for a big case, she became detached, focused on nothing but winning. He had stopped expecting warmth from her years ago. So when she pulled away from him, when she came home late and avoided conversation, he didn't question it. He simply accepted it as part of their marriage. But he had no idea what was really happening. That while he was sitting across from Daniel in their therapy sessions, trying to help him, Daniel was already tearing his life apart. And Julia, calculated, ruthless Julia, was realizing too late that she had made a mistake. Elliot Graves had spent his life untangling the minds of others, guiding them through their darkest moments, helping them understand their own self-destruction. Yet, for all his expertise, he had failed to see the destruction happening in his own home. He had ignored the signs, the late nights, the distance, the vague excuses. Maybe because he trusted Julia, maybe because he didn't want to believe she was capable of betraying him. But denial had an expiration date, and Elliot had just reached his. The discovery wasn't cinematic. There was no anonymous letter, no dramatic confession. The truth had been staring him in the face for weeks. It was in the way Julia avoided him, in the way she flinched when he touched her, in the way she had stopped pretending to care. It was in the way Daniel Kessler looked at him during their sessions, the barely concealed smirk. The way he pushed boundaries just enough to make Elliot uncomfortable, but never enough to call it out. And then, finally, undeniable proof. It was a Saturday evening when Elliot drove past a hotel on the outskirts of Charlotte. He hadn't been looking for them. He had been coming back from an out-of-town conference, exhausted, ready to go home and sleep. But as he pulled up to a red light, he saw her. Julia. She was stepping out of a car with Daniel. The moment was brief, only a few seconds, but it was enough. He knew his wife well, knew her body language, knew the way she moved. This wasn't business. This wasn't a chance meeting. She wasn't arguing, wasn't pulling away. She was with him. And Daniel, standing too close, too comfortable, met Elliot's gaze through the windshield. And he smiled. Elliot didn't remember the rest of the drive home. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles ached, but he felt nothing. It wasn't just the betrayal that burned. It was the humiliation. The fact that Daniel had been sitting across from him, pretending to need help, pretending to be reformed, while at the same time tearing his life apart. By the time Julia arrived home that night, Elliot was waiting. She hesitated when she saw him standing in the living room. Maybe she sensed it immediately. Maybe she had been expecting this moment for weeks. She set down her bag, slow, controlled, already thinking, already calculating. Where were you? Elliot's voice was calm, too calm. Julia, ever the attorney, chose her words carefully. Out, out, Elliot repeated. He nodded, then exhaled, running a hand over his face. With Daniel. A beat of silence. Then, instead of denial, she went straight to anger. You've been following me? Elliot almost laughed. She was good, turning it around, making herself the victim. But not this time. I saw you, he said, voice low. You weren't careful. Julia's expression shifted, just for a second. A flicker of realization, of miscalculation. Then, the mask returned. And what do you want me to say? She asked. Elliot stepped closer. The truth. Julia crossed her arms, as if bracing herself. Fine. It happened. It's over now. It wasn't, but Elliot let her lie. How long? Julia didn't answer. How long? She exhaled sharply. A few months. Elliot nodded slowly. The answer didn't matter. It could have been a week, a year. The betrayal felt the same. Are you in love with him? The hesitation was all the answer he needed. Elliot turned away, chest heaving, hands shaking. He wasn't sure if it was rage or grief. Maybe both. Julia watched him carefully. She was still thinking ahead, still weighing outcomes. This doesn't have to get ugly, she said. Elliot turned back to her, and for the first time in their marriage, he saw her clearly. She wasn't afraid of what she had done. She was afraid of what it would cost her. She was afraid of exposure. If Elliot went public, it would ruin her. She had spent her career crafting an image of power, precision, and control. A high-profile defense attorney, respected and feared. If news of an affair with a former criminal came out, it wouldn't just be a scandal. It would be a career death sentence. And Daniel? His criminal record would make him an easy suspect if this escalated into something worse. If Elliot decided to retaliate, if this turned into something bigger, Daniel would be the first one the police would look at. Julia wasn't scared of losing Elliot. She was scared of losing everything else. Elliot saw it in her eyes, and it made his decision easier. I'm not going to stay silent, he said. Julia's jaw tensed. What does that mean? It means I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen. For the first time, a flash of something close to panic crossed her face. She knew what that meant. Divorce. Public humiliation. A scandal that would follow her for years. You need to think about this, she said, voice low, measured. You need to think about what you're about to do. Elliot held her gaze. So do you. He turned and left the room. Julia stood frozen, her mind already working, already planning. She had spent her life winning impossible cases. Now, she had to figure out how to win this one. Daniel was waiting for her call that night. When she told him Elliot knew, his reaction wasn't fear. It was anger. He's not going to keep this quiet, Julia warned. Daniel exhaled sharply. Then we have a problem. Julia didn't respond. Daniel's voice darkened. You know I can handle problems. Julia closed her eyes, gripping the phone tighter. She had thought she was in control, but for the first time, she wasn't sure if she had just created something she couldn't stop. Julia Graves had spent her entire career controlling narratives. She had defended men accused of crimes they swore they didn't commit and men who were guilty beyond a doubt. She knew how to twist a story, how to shift blame, how to create doubt where there was none. Now, she wasn't just defending someone. She was orchestrating something. Daniel Kessler had always been dangerous, but until now, Julia had ignored it. She had let herself believe she was in control, that she could handle him. But after Elliot's confrontation, after the way he had looked at her, after the way he had promised he wouldn't stay silent, everything changed. Elliot wasn't just a problem. He was a threat. She couldn't afford a scandal. A divorce was one thing. It would be a messy headline, a brief public embarrassment, but she would recover. An affair with a man like Daniel? That was career-ending. The moment Elliot decided to expose her, she would lose everything she had built. And Daniel? He wouldn't survive the fallout. Julia knew Daniel. She knew his temper, his insecurities, the way he saw himself as a man constantly fighting against a world that wanted to keep him down. She also knew how much he wanted to believe he was protecting her. That was the key. That was how she would turn this into something she could control. She never directly told him to harm Elliot. That would have been too risky. Instead, she influenced his thinking in a way that guided his actions. She started with fear. Elliot was a problem, she told Daniel. A loose end. He wouldn't just let things go. He was angry, he was bitter, and he had power. A respected psychiatrist with connections in law enforcement. A man who knew the right people, who could make things difficult for them both. Daniel's reaction was immediate. His jaw clenched, his body tensed. What's he going to do? He demanded. Julia hesitated, just long enough to make it seem like she was struggling with the truth. Then she sighed. I don't know, she admitted, but I don't trust him. It was enough. Daniel already hated Elliot. He had spent months sitting in front of him, pretending to respect him, pretending to be grateful for his help, all while knowing he was sleeping with his wife. The idea that Elliot could take Julia away from him, that he could ruin them both, sent him into a spiral. He's not going to ruin us, Daniel said. Julia let the words sit between them. Us. She touched his arm. I don't know what to do. Daniel straightened. I do. From there, it was easy. She played her role perfectly, concerned, hesitant, just scared enough to let Daniel feel like he was the one making the decisions. He thought he was protecting her. He thought this was his idea. Meanwhile, Julia was already setting the stage for what came next. She started talking about Daniel differently in public. Casual mentions to colleagues, friends. Nothing obvious, just small, concerned remarks. He's been acting strange, she told a friend over drinks. I don't know, sometimes I wonder if he's really changed. To another, she sighed. He gets jealous easily. It's sweet in a way, but sometimes it worries me. To a colleague at the firm, he's intense, passionate, but intense. I hope he never takes it too far. The remarks weren't meant to sound urgent. That was the point. She wanted them to sit, unnoticed, in people's minds, so that later, when it mattered, they would remember. Daniel, meanwhile, was focused on one thing, getting rid of Elliot. He started watching him, tracking his schedule, memorizing his habits. He wasn't careful about it, but he thought he was. Julia never asked him to, never brought it up, but she made sure to seem relieved when he mentioned it. He's still talking about it, Daniel told her one night. I saw him meeting with one of his colleagues. What if he's already spreading it around? Julia exhaled, like she was struggling with the weight of it all. I don't know, she whispered. Maybe I should talk to him. No, Daniel said immediately. Julia hesitated. Then what do we do? Daniel had the answer. We take care of it. Now, it was just a matter of planning. It had to look like an accident, or a crime of passion. A messy, unpredictable moment where Daniel could claim he lost control, or better yet, something that had nothing to do with Daniel at all. Julia made suggestions, subtly, carefully. You know he goes for a run in the evenings, she said one night, offhand. That path by the river is always so dark. Later, she sighed. It's scary how easy it would be for someone to break in. He never locks the back door properly. Daniel listened. They went through scenarios. A robbery gone wrong? Too many variables. An accident? Difficult to stage. But an argument, one that turned into such a confrontation? That, Daniel could do. It would have to be somewhere private. Somewhere there would be no witnesses, no cameras, no way for Elliot to fight back. Julia waited for the moment Daniel would suggest it himself. We should meet with him, he finally said. Talk to him. Try to get him to back off. Julia nodded slowly. It's worth a try. Elliot Graves was methodical. He built his career on understanding people, recognizing patterns, and staying in control of every situation. But when he stepped into his house that evening, something felt different. His instincts, the same ones that had guided him through years of working with troubled patients, told him something was off. It wasn't just the missing planner or the office keys that had vanished without explanation. It was the way everything around him felt too still. Julia sat at the kitchen table, a half-empty glass of wine in front of her, flipping through a case file as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Elliot had already accepted that his marriage was over. That much had been clear from the moment Julia admitted to the affair without a trace of regret. He wasn't naive. He had seen plenty of relationships fall apart, had counseled patients through messy divorces, had witnessed firsthand how easily people could turn on each other when something they had built for years suddenly collapsed. But this wasn't just an affair. It wasn't just a marriage ending. Something else was happening, and Julia was making sure he didn't see it until it was too late. Elliot sat down across from her, watching her closely. She barely looked up. No tension, no nervousness, nothing in her body language that suggested she was expecting a fight. When he brought up the missing planner and keys, she dismissed it entirely. Didn't even try to offer an excuse. Just waved it off like it was insignificant. He had seen this tactic before. It was the same way she handled witnesses on the stand. Calm, deflective, always in control. If you made someone question their own certainty, you didn't need to lie. You just made them doubt themselves enough to drop the subject. Except Elliot wasn't a witness. He wasn't going to let this go. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Julia kept flipping through her papers, uninterested in whatever he was thinking. This was what bothered him the most. Not that she had betrayed him, but that she was treating him like a problem to be managed, something to be minimized and set aside. For a moment, he considered pushing harder, pressing her on the details. But he stopped himself. Julia had already made up her mind about how this was going to go. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't worried. Because in her mind, she had already won. Elliot stood up. Julia didn't look up. She let him walk away without a word. That was the moment he knew. This wasn't just about her protecting herself. It was about something much bigger than that. Julia wasn't going to let him walk away from this cleanly. And she wasn't going to do it alone. Daniel Kessler had been spiraling for weeks. Julia had shaped the way he saw Elliot, turning him into the one thing standing between them. She never had to tell Daniel directly what needed to happen. She just let him come to his own conclusions, carefully guiding him toward an inevitable decision. He had always been unstable. He had spent years trying to prove to people that he had changed, that he wasn't the same aggressive, impulsive man he had been in the past. But deep down, he was. And Julia knew exactly how to push him. She had spent the past few weeks making sure people saw him the way she wanted. Subtle comments to colleagues and friends, nothing dramatic, just small concerns here and there. That he had a temper. That he was unpredictable. That sometimes she worried about how obsessive he could be. It didn't need to be a direct accusation, just enough to plant the idea. If something happened, people would remember. Daniel had started watching Elliot more closely. He followed him, tracked his schedule, memorized his movements. He thought he was being discreet, but Elliot had noticed something wasn't right. A few days earlier, he had spotted a car parked down the street, engine running. When he stepped outside, it pulled away. The next night, he thought he heard footsteps outside his office after hours, but when he checked, the hallway was empty. It could have been coincidence, but Elliot knew better. The next morning, he went through his usual routine, forcing himself to stay focused on work. His patients were waiting, his schedule was full, and he wasn't going to let this situation consume him. Whatever was happening, whatever Julia and Daniel were trying to do, he wasn't going to let them dictate how this played out. The day proceeded as expected. Patients came and went. Appointments were kept. No one noticed anything unusual about Elliot's demeanor. If he suspected something was wrong, he kept it to himself. But he was unsettled. The missing office keys and planner from the night before weren't accidents, and his conversation with Julia had done nothing to ease his concerns. As the afternoon stretched on and the last few patients left, Elliot remained at his desk. He debated going home early, but decided to finish paperwork instead. It was a decision that placed him exactly where Julia and Daniel needed him to be. Daniel wasn't scheduled for an appointment that day, but there he was, standing outside Elliot's office door as the last staff members packed up to leave. Elliot noticed him immediately. The way he stood there, lingering, hesitating before entering, it was different. It wasn't the behavior of a patient seeking help. It was something else. Once inside, Daniel sat down across from Elliot, but there was no sense of counseling, no structured session. Instead, there was silence. The tension was immediate. Elliot had spent his career dealing with troubled individuals, men and women caught between self-destruction and redemption. He had guided people through addiction, broken relationships, and the psychological wreckage of their pasts. But Daniel wasn't looking for guidance anymore. Daniel made it clear that he knew Elliot was aware of the affair. He spoke with a confidence that made it obvious. This wasn't a confession. It was a challenge. Elliot, in Daniel's mind, was no longer his psychiatrist. He was an obstacle. Elliot wasn't easily rattled. But the way Daniel spoke set off alarm bells. It wasn't just arrogance or aggression. It was possession. Daniel spoke about Julia as if she belonged to him, as if Elliot had already been removed from the picture. Elliot had worked with many difficult patients in his career. He had experience dealing with individuals struggling with anger and impulse control, always maintaining professionalism in high-tension situations. Elliot told Daniel that he wasn't going to let this go, that he wasn't going to sit back and let Julia and Daniel dictate what happened next. And that was the moment Daniel snapped. There was no long, drawn-out struggle, no screaming, no dramatic confrontation, just a single moment where the tension turned physical. Maybe tensions escalated too quickly, and Daniel lost control. Maybe he confronted Elliot, expecting a different outcome, but the situation turned physical. Whatever happened in that office, by the time it was over, Elliot was no longer alive. For the first few seconds, Daniel didn't move. The reality of what had just happened hadn't fully set in. Then, as the shock faded, panic took over. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He hadn't planned this. Or maybe he had. Maybe he had told himself it would never actually come to this, that something would stop him before it went too far. He pulled out his phone but hesitated. He couldn't call for help. He couldn't be here. And then, almost instinctively, he called Julia. Julia's reaction was immediate. She didn't panic. She didn't yell. She just told him exactly what to do. Daniel was still in shock, but Julia was calm. She guided him through every step. What to move, what to leave untouched, how to wipe down the surfaces he had touched. She made sure that whatever evidence remained pointed in a direction that wouldn't lead back to her. She told him to leave. And Daniel, still struggling to process what had just happened, followed her instructions without question. By the time Elliot was discovered later that evening, Julia had already returned to work. She played the role of the devastated widow flawlessly, composed, yet shaken, cooperating fully with law enforcement. She told the detectives everything they needed to hear. She said that Elliot had been struggling lately, that their marriage had been strained, but that she had never imagined anything like this would happen. She suggested that, if there was anyone to be concerned about, it would be Daniel. She expressed worry over his behavior in recent weeks, saying that he had been acting erratic, that he had grown possessive, that she had even confided in a few colleagues about her concerns. The comments were subtle but effective. They shaped the perception that Daniel had been unpredictable, leading investigators to consider whether his actions had played a role in what happened. And law enforcement picked up on it right away. Detectives started looking into Daniel's background. He had a history of arrests, past aggressive behavior, and a documented struggle with addiction. Witnesses came forward, recounting moments when Daniel had lost his temper, times when he had fixated on Julia in a way that seemed unhealthy. Then there was the forensic evidence. Daniel had followed Julia's instructions as best he could, but mistakes had been made. His fingerprints were still in the office, on surfaces that suggested he had been there longer than just a casual visit. Security footage placed him near the building at the time of the incident. Phone records showed a call between him and Julia immediately after. As investigators pieced together the timeline, Julia's strategy became clear. She had positioned Daniel as the only real suspect, making sure that when law enforcement followed the evidence, they would find exactly what she needed them to find. Daniel's behavior in the aftermath only made things worse. He was visibly shaken when questioned, and his responses were inconsistent. He denied involvement but struggled to provide a clear alibi. His panic only reinforced what detectives were beginning to believe, that he had been responsible for Elliot's death. Julia, on the other hand, remained calm. She answered every question, played the part of the grieving wife, and never once appeared nervous. By the time detectives gathered enough evidence, Daniel Kessler became the primary suspect. His past struggles with emotional instability and past legal issues raised concerns, and investigators focused on his connection to Elliot's death. Daniel Kessler remained the primary suspect as detectives worked to finalize the case against him. His past arrests, his connection to Julia Graves, and the inconsistencies in his statements gave law enforcement enough reason to continue pressing him. His phone records showed calls to Julia immediately after Elliot Graves' death, further raising suspicion about her possible involvement. As investigators reviewed surveillance footage, they found a key contradiction in Julia's timeline. She had stated that she was home the night before Elliot's death, but cameras near Elliot's office showed her car in the area. This did not prove she had been inside, but it was enough to discredit her alibi. Detectives also obtained statements from a janitor who had been working late that night. He recalled seeing a woman matching Julia's description near the office. This, combined with her false alibi, shifted attention toward her. Forensic evidence supported the theory that the crime scene had been manipulated. The position of Elliot and certain objects in the room did not match the characteristics of an unplanned altercation. Investigators suspected that someone had tried to mislead them. The further investigation report also ruled out natural causes, confirming that Elliot's death had resulted from external factors. A colleague of Julia's provided another piece of evidence. Just days before Elliot's death, she had mentioned concerns about Daniel's behavior. She described him as unpredictable and possessive, implying that she was worried about his actions. This statement raised suspicions that Julia had intentionally shaped the narrative before the crime took place. As detectives confronted Daniel with the growing evidence, his behavior changed. Under pressure, he shifted from denying involvement to implicating Julia. He told investigators that she had influenced his decisions and that she had instructed him on what to do after Elliot's death. His statements, combined with the forensic inconsistencies and Julia's false alibi, provided authorities with enough grounds to move forward with charges against her. Julia Graves was arrested at her law office in front of colleagues and clients. She was charged with conspiracy to commit the crime and obstruction of justice. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, surveillance footage, and Daniel Kessler's testimony, which detailed her involvement in the events leading to Elliot Graves' death. Daniel accepted a plea deal in exchange for a reduced sentence and provided testimony against Julia. He admitted to confronting Elliot and described how Julia had influenced his decisions. Julia denied all allegations and maintained that she had no role in the crime. After reviewing the evidence, the jury found her guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and obstruction of justice. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Daniel pleaded guilty to reduced charges as part of a plea deal. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years for his role in Elliot Graves' death and for tampering with evidence.